Why you attract emotionally unavailable people. There's a question that quietly follows millions of people through their lives. It usually appears after another disappointing relationship, after another late-night conversation with a friend, after another moment of staring at a phone, wondering why someone who seemed interested suddenly became distant. The question is simple. Why do I keep attracting emotionally unavailable people? At first, the answer seems obvious. Bad luck, wrong timing, the dating culture, the apps, the city you live in, the people around you. But if the same type of relationship keeps appearing in different forms, something deeper may be happening, because eventually the faces change, the names change, the circumstances change, yet the emotional experience remains strangely familiar. You meet someone, there's chemistry, excitement, possibility. You feel drawn to them almost immediately. For a moment, it feels different from everything that came before. Then something begins to shift. They become harder to read, harder to reach, more distant, more inconsistent. And instead of losing interest, you become more invested. You think about them more often. You analyze their behavior. You replay conversations. You search for clues. You try to understand what changed. And without realizing it, your emotional energy starts revolving around someone who isn't fully available. Most people assume this happens because the other person is special, because there is extraordinary chemistry, because the connection is somehow deeper than normal. But psychology offers another explanation, one that is far less romantic and far more revealing. The people who trigger the strongest emotions in us are not always the people who are most compatible with us. Sometimes they are simply the people who activate old emotional patterns that were established long before we ever entered the dating world. To understand this, we need to talk about something most people rarely consider, the difference between love and familiarity. Many people spend years believing they are searching for love, but in reality, the nervous system often searches for familiarity first. This happens because the brain is designed to predict. It wants to know what comes next. It wants certainty, and it creates that certainty by relying on patterns it learned early in life. Those patterns become internal maps, invisible blueprints, templates for what relationships are supposed to feel like. The strange thing is that these templates are not built from what is healthy. They are built from what is experienced. If a child grows up in an environment where affection is consistent, emotional safety becomes familiar. If a child grows up in an environment where affection is unpredictable, unpredictability becomes familiar. The brain does not stop to ask whether the pattern is beneficial. It simply records it, stores it, learns from it. And later, when similar emotional conditions appear in adulthood, something inside us recognizes them, not consciously, but emotionally. This recognition often feels like attraction. Imagine meeting two different people. The first person is clear, consistent, emotionally present. You always know where you stand. The second person is harder to read, warm one day, distant the next, interested but cautious, close but never fully available. Which one creates more mental activity? Which one occupies more space in your thoughts? For many people, it's the second, not because the second person is a better partner, but because uncertainty demands attention. The human mind struggles with unfinished stories. It struggles with unanswered questions. When something feels unresolved, the brain keeps returning to it, trying to complete the puzzle, trying to reduce uncertainty, trying to regain a sense of control. This is one reason emotionally unavailable people can feel so magnetic. They create emotional questions that never seem fully answered. And the more questions the brain encounters, the more attention it gives. This attention is often mistaken for love, but attention and love are not the same thing. You can think about someone constantly without actually feeling safe with them. You can feel intense chemistry with someone who is completely wrong for you. You can become emotionally attached to someone who cannot meet your needs, and that's where many people become trapped, because intensity feels meaningful. The stronger the emotion, the more significant it appears. Yet some of the strongest emotions humans experience are rooted in fear, uncertainty, longing, and anxiety. Not connection, not intimacy, not love. The challenge is that anxiety and attraction can feel remarkably similar inside the body. Both increase focus, both increase emotional arousal, both create anticipation, both keep your attention locked onto a specific person. This is why so many people confuse emotional activation with compatibility. They assume that because someone creates strong feelings, they must be important. but importance and activation are not the same thing. And once you understand that distinction, your entire perspective on relationships begins to change. Because the question is no longer, why do I keep attracting emotionally unavailable people? The question becomes, why do emotionally unavailable people feel so familiar to me? And the answer to that question often begins many years before your first relationship. For most people, the story begins long before they are old enough to understand what love is. A child does not analyze relationships. A child experiences them. Every interaction becomes information, every moment of comfort, every moment of rejection, every moment of emotional connection, every moment of emotional distance. The developing brain absorbs all of it, not as facts, but as expectations. This is one of the most important ideas in psychology. Children don't learn what relationships should be, they learn what relationships are, and those lessons become surprisingly difficult to rewrite later in life. Imagine a child whose emotional needs are met consistently. When they're upset, someone responds. When they're afraid, someone provides comfort. When they feel overwhelmed, someone helps them regulate their emotions. Over time, the child develops a simple but powerful belief. People can be trusted. Connection is safe. Love is available. Now imagine a different environment. Not necessarily abusive, not necessarily traumatic in the way people often imagine trauma, just inconsistent. A parent who is loving when they're in a good mood, distant when they're stressed, present physically but unavailable emotionally. A child never knows exactly what version of that parent they will encounter, so they adapt, because adaptation is what children do. They become more observant, more sensitive, more focused on emotional signals. They learn to monitor moods. They learn to anticipate changes. They learn to work for connection. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to associate love with effort, love with uncertainty, love with emotional labor. Years later, those lessons don't disappear. They become invisible rules, rules that continue operating beneath conscious awareness. This is why many adults find themselves attracted to people who make them work for attention, people who are difficult to understand, people who are difficult to reach, people who never seem fully available. The emotional challenge feels familiar, and familiarity often feels safe, even when it isn't. One of the most surprising discoveries in psychology is that humans often prefer familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. Think about that for a moment. Familiar pain, unfamiliar peace. Most people assume they are actively choosing happiness, but the nervous system is usually choosing predictability. If chaos feels familiar, chaos can feel strangely comfortable. If uncertainty feels familiar, uncertainty can feel exciting. If emotional distance feels familiar, emotional distance can feel attractive. This doesn't happen because people enjoy suffering. It happens because the brain values what it understands, and understanding creates a sense of control, even when the situation itself is unhealthy. This explains why emotionally available people sometimes feel less exciting, less magnetic, less compelling, not because something is wrong with them, but because they don't activate the old emotional blueprint. They don't create the same familiar tension, the same emotional chase, the same uncertainty, the same need to earn connection. And for someone whose nervous system learned to associate love with effort, healthy relationships can initially feel strange, almost too easy, too calm, too predictable. Some people even describe healthy partners as boring. But what they're often experiencing isn't boredom, they're experiencing the absence of emotional chaos. And if emotional chaos has been present throughout life, its absence can feel unfamiliar. This is where many people make a mistake. They leave healthy relationships because they don't feel the same intensity. Then they return to emotionally unavailable people because the emotional spark feels stronger. But intensity is not proof of compatibility. Intensity is often proof of activation. And activation is not the same thing as connection. Connection creates safety. Activation creates urgency. Connection allows you to relax. Activation forces you to monitor. Connection gives clarity. Activation creates confusion. Yet confusion can become addictive. Because the human brain hates uncertainty. And when uncertainty appears, it immediately begins searching for answers. This search can become all-consuming. A delayed text message becomes meaningful. A change in tone becomes significant. A canceled plan becomes evidence. A small gesture becomes a clue. The brain becomes an investigator. trying to solve a mystery, trying to predict an outcome, trying to regain certainty. But emotionally unavailable people rarely provide certainty. That's part of what makes the cycle so powerful. The reward never arrives consistently enough for the nervous system to relax. Instead, it arrives just often enough to keep hope alive. And hope can be one of the strongest emotional forces in human behavior. Hope convinces people to wait. Hope convinces people to tolerate uncertainty. Hope convinces people to ignore red flags. Hope convinces people that the next message, the next conversation, the next moment of vulnerability will finally change everything. Sometimes it does. Most of the time it doesn't. Because emotionally unavailable people are often fighting their own internal battles: fear of intimacy, fear of dependence, fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control. And when two people meet, one who fears abandonment and one who fears closeness, the result can be a relationship that feels intensely passionate while simultaneously becoming emotionally exhausting. One person moves closer, the other moves away. The distance creates anxiety. The anxiety creates pursuit. The pursuit creates pressure. The pressure creates withdrawal. And the cycle repeats itself again and again and again until one person finally asks a question that changes everything. What if I'm not attracted to this person because they're right for me? What if I'm attracted to this person because they feel familiar? That question has the power to transform an entire life, because once you begin examining your patterns instead of your partner's, everything starts looking different. You stop asking why the same thing keeps happening to you, and you begin asking what keeps drawing you toward the same emotional experience. That shift is where healing begins, not in the relationship, not in the other person, but within yourself. This is where the story becomes even more interesting, because most people believe they're chasing a person. In reality, they're often chasing a feeling, and that feeling has a powerful biological component. Every time you anticipate something rewarding, your brain releases dopamine. Many people think dopamine is the chemical of pleasure. It isn't. Dopamine is more closely related to anticipation, to wanting, to seeking, to pursuing. That's an important distinction, because your brain can crave something even when that thing is making you miserable. Think about how often people become obsessed with relationships that bring them more anxiety than happiness. They tell themselves they're in love, but if they honestly examine their daily experience, they spend more time worrying than enjoying, more time analyzing than connecting, more time hoping than receiving. So why does the attachment become stronger instead of weaker? Because uncertainty creates anticipation, and anticipation keeps the dopamine system active. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, someone consistently responds to your messages. They're reliable, predictable, emotionally available. You know where you stand. Your nervous system relaxes. In the second scenario, someone responds unpredictably, sometimes quickly, sometimes not at all, sometimes with enthusiasm, sometimes with distance. Now your brain becomes alert. Every notification matters. Every interaction feels important. Every sign of affection feels like a reward. And because those rewards are unpredictable, they become psychologically powerful. This principle has been observed across countless studies of human behavior. Variable rewards are often more engaging than guaranteed rewards. It's one of the reasons gambling becomes addictive. The next reward might be just around the corner. The next win might change everything. The next message might finally provide clarity. The next conversation might finally bring commitment. The next moment might finally make all the uncertainty worthwhile. Notice the word that keeps appearing: might. Emotionally unavailable relationships survive on possibility, not reality. Possibility. The possibility that things could change. The possibility that they secretly care more than they show. The possibility that one day they'll become the partner you've imagined. And imagination is incredibly powerful. Sometimes people become attached not to who someone is, but to who they hope that person could become. The relationship exists partly in reality and partly in fantasy. The real person may be inconsistent, distant, emotionally guarded, but the imagined version is loving, committed, available, and the mind constantly moves between those two versions. One creates disappointment, the other creates hope. This creates an emotional roller coaster, and roller coasters are exciting. That's what makes them difficult to leave. Many people mistake emotional highs and lows for passion, but passion and instability are not the same thing. A relationship can feel incredibly intense while simultaneously being unhealthy. In fact, intensity often increases when stability decreases. That's why some of the most painful relationships become the hardest to leave, not because they are fulfilling, but because they are activating. Every small moment of affection feels amplified. Every moment of distance feels devastating. The emotional contrast becomes enormous, and contrast creates emotional addiction. Think about someone who receives affection consistently. The experience feels good, but eventually it becomes expected. Now think about someone who receives affection only occasionally. That affection suddenly feels incredibly valuable, not because there is more of it, but because there is less of it. Scarcity changes perception. The human brain often assigns greater value to things that appear difficult to obtain, and emotionally unavailable people often feel difficult to obtain, not intentionally, not always, but their emotional distance creates scarcity, and scarcity creates desire. This is one reason people can become attached to relationships that objectively provide very little emotional nourishment. They're surviving on occasional emotional rewards, small moments of connection, brief glimpses of intimacy, rare expressions of vulnerability, and each one feels significant because it is uncommon. The relationship begins functioning like a cycle of deprivation and reward. The deprivation increases longing, the reward increases hope. The hope keeps the cycle alive. What makes this especially dangerous is that the brain starts associating relief with love. When someone who has been distant finally reaches out, the anxiety temporarily disappears. And that relief feels wonderful, so wonderful that it can be mistaken for evidence of deep connection. But often, what feels good is not the relationship itself, it's the temporary end of uncertainty. Imagine being thirsty for hours. The first sip of water feels incredible, not because the water is extraordinary, but because the deprivation made it feel extraordinary. Many emotionally unavailable relationships operate in a similar way. The emotional deprivation increases the perceived value of small moments of connection. And gradually, people stop evaluating the relationship based on how it actually feels. Instead, they evaluate it based on how relieved they feel when the uncertainty briefly disappears. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges a story many people tell themselves. The story that they're fighting for love. Sometimes they're fighting for relief. Sometimes they're fighting for validation. Sometimes they're fighting for a chance to heal an old wound through a new person. And that's where the deepest layer of this pattern begins to reveal itself. Because the attraction isn't only about dopamine, it isn't only about uncertainty, it isn't only about emotional availability, it's about identity, it's about the beliefs people carry about themselves, and those beliefs quietly influence every relationship they enter, whether they realize it or not. At the center of many emotionally painful relationships lies a belief that rarely gets spoken out loud. A belief so familiar that people often mistake it for reality. The belief sounds something like this: I am not enough, not smart enough, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not interesting enough, not worthy enough. Most people don't walk through life consciously repeating these words. The belief operates quietly, in the background, hidden beneath everyday thoughts and behaviors, but its influence can be enormous. Because when someone secretly doubts their own worth, relationships stop being only about connection. They become about validation, about proving something, about earning something, about finally receiving confirmation that they are worthy of love. And emotionally unavailable people often become the perfect target for this unconscious mission. Why? Because they are difficult to win over, difficult to reach, difficult to secure. If someone openly loves you, there is nothing to prove. But if someone remains distant, their approval starts feeling valuable, their affection starts feeling valuable, their commitment starts feeling valuable, not necessarily because they are valuable, but because it is scarce, and scarcity creates perceived importance. This creates a dangerous psychological trap. Instead of asking, does this person meet my emotional needs, people start asking, how can I make this person choose me? Notice the difference. The focus shifts away from compatibility, away from mutual connection, away from emotional health, and toward earning approval. At that point, the relationship becomes a performance, a test, a mission, and missions are difficult to abandon, because abandoning the mission can feel like admitting failure. Many people stay trapped in unhealthy relationships because leaving feels emotionally similar to losing. They think, if I leave now, it means I wasn't enough. If I leave now, it means they won. If I leave now, it means I failed. But that interpretation is built on a false assumption. The assumption that another person's inability to love fully reflects your value. It doesn't. An emotionally unavailable person's limitations belong to them, not to you. Their fear of intimacy is not proof that you are unlovable. Their inconsistency is not proof that you are unworthy. Their emotional distance is not proof that you lack value. Yet, when old wounds are active, everything becomes personal. Every rejection feels like confirmation. Every withdrawal feels like evidence. Every disappointment feels like a verdict. And the mind starts collecting these moments, building a case against itself. This is one reason emotionally unavailable relationships can be so damaging, not because they create new insecurities, but because they often activate insecurities that already exist. They shine a spotlight on old fears, old doubts, old beliefs. Beliefs that may have been formed years or even decades earlier, and until those beliefs are questioned, the pattern tends to repeat. Different person, same emotional experience. Different relationship, same emotional outcome. The details change, the pattern remains. This is why healing is not primarily about finding a better partner. Many people believe the solution is simply choosing different people, and while better choices matter, they are not enough on their own. Because if the internal blueprint remains unchanged, the same attraction can reappear in different forms. Healing begins when you start examining the beliefs underneath the attraction. What am I trying to prove? What am I hoping to earn? What does this person's approval represent to me? What would it mean if they finally chose me? For many people, the answers are surprising, because the relationship was never just about the relationship. It was about self-worth. It was about validation. It was about finally feeling enough. And that's a burden no relationship can successfully carry. No partner can permanently solve a problem that originates within your relationship with yourself. At best, they can temporarily distract you from it, but eventually the insecurity returns, which is why true healing requires something deeper. Not more chasing, not more analyzing, not more waiting, but a different way of relating to yourself, a way that is built on self-respect instead of self-doubt, because self-respect changes attraction. It changes what feels exciting. It changes what feels acceptable. It changes what feels normal. Someone who respects themselves begins noticing things they once ignored: mixed signals, inconsistency, lack of effort, emotional unavailability, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because clarity removes illusion, the fantasy begins to fade. The excuses begin to fade, the endless hope begins to fade, and reality becomes easier to see, not the person you imagine, the person who actually exists, not the relationship you hope for, the relationship that is actually happening. This can feel painful at first, because reality often requires letting go of possibility, letting go of the future you imagined, letting go of the version of the story you wanted to believe. But there is also freedom in that process, because the moment you stop chasing potential, you gain the ability to evaluate reality. And reality is where healthy relationships live, not in fantasy, not in possibility, not in promises, in reality. Healthy love does not require constant interpretation. It does not require endless guessing. It does not require emotional detective work. It does not leave you questioning your value every day. Healthy love creates security, not perfection, not certainty about the future, but emotional safety in the present. And for many people, that level of safety feels unfamiliar at first, almost suspicious, because they have spent years associating love with struggle, with longing, with uncertainty, with emotional highs and lows. But eventually something remarkable happens. The nervous system starts learning a new pattern, a new definition of connection, a new understanding of what love actually feels like. And that's when the cycle finally begins to break. Breaking the cycle rarely happens in one dramatic moment. There is no magical realization that suddenly erases years of emotional conditioning. No single video, no single conversation, no single relationship. Real change happens differently. It happens quietly, slowly, almost invisibly at first. It begins with awareness, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. For years, many people move through relationships on autopilot. They call it chemistry, they call it attraction, they call it fate. But once you understand your patterns, something changes. You begin noticing the difference between what feels familiar and what is actually good for you, and that distinction can change the course of your entire life. At first, the change feels uncomfortable, not empowering, not exciting, uncomfortable. Because healing often requires choosing what feels unfamiliar. Imagine spending years listening to the same song. Eventually, it becomes normal, even if it's sad, even if it's painful, even if it keeps you stuck. Now imagine someone turns off that song. The silence feels strange, maybe even wrong. Not because the song was good for you, but because you became accustomed to it. The same thing happens in relationships. When someone has spent years associating love with uncertainty, stability can feel unfamiliar, predictability can feel boring, consistency can feel uneventful, and emotional availability can feel almost suspicious. Many people enter healthy relationships and find themselves waiting for something bad to happen, waiting for distance, waiting for withdrawal, waiting for disappointment, because their nervous system has learned to expect it. When it doesn't arrive, they feel confused, not relieved, confused. This is one of the most important moments in healing, because this is where many people accidentally return to old patterns. The chaos feels familiar, the calm feels unfamiliar, and familiarity often wins, unless you consciously choose otherwise. This is why healing requires patience. Your mind may understand something long before your nervous system believes it. You may intellectually recognize that a healthy partner is good for you, but emotionally, your body may still crave the excitement of unpredictability. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. Your brain is simply following pathways it has traveled for years, and pathways become stronger through repetition. The good news is that new pathways can also be created through repetition. Every time you choose self-respect over chasing validation, every time you walk away from inconsistency, every time you stop making excuses for emotional unavailability, every time you honor your needs instead of abandoning them, you strengthen a different pathway, a healthier one, a more secure one. Over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The people who once seemed irresistible start looking different, not because they changed, because you changed. You start seeing what you couldn't see before: the mixed signals, the emotional distance, the lack of effort, the inability to communicate, the absence of genuine intimacy. What once looked mysterious now looks unavailable. What once looked exciting now looks exhausting. What once looked like chemistry now looks like a familiar pattern, and perhaps for the first time you stop romanticizing it. You stop trying to save it. You stop trying to fix it. You stop trying to earn what should be given freely. This is where freedom begins. Not when the perfect partner arrives, not when someone finally chooses you, not when all uncertainty disappears. Freedom begins when your sense of worth no longer depends on another person's ability to love you, because that is the truth many people spend years trying to learn. Your value is not determined by who stays. Your value is not determined by who leaves. Your value is not determined by who texts back, who commits, who changes, or who walks away. Your value existed before all of them, and it remains after all of them. Once you truly understand that, relationships start becoming simpler. Not easy, but simpler. You stop asking, "How do I make them love me?" and start asking, "Does this relationship deserve my love?" You stop asking, "Why are they pulling away?" and start asking, "Why am I ignoring my own needs?" You stop asking, "What can I do to keep them?" and start asking, "What am I doing to keep myself?" These questions change everything, because they bring your attention back to the only person you can truly control, yourself. And that shift is the foundation of secure attachment. Not controlling others, not predicting others, not fixing others, but trusting yourself, trusting your ability to recognize what is healthy, trusting your ability to leave what isn't, trusting your ability to survive disappointment, trusting your ability to choose differently. Because the goal is not to become someone who never experiences rejection. The goal is to become someone who no longer sees rejection as proof of unworthiness. And once that happens, emotionally unavailable people lose much of their power. The cycle weakens, the obsession fades, the confusion fades. The endless questioning fades, not overnight, but gradually, until one day you realize something extraordinary. The kind of relationship that once consumed your thoughts no longer attracts you. The kind of person who once felt irresistible no longer feels special. and the peace you once called boring has become something else entirely. It has become safety, it has become clarity, it has become freedom, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Love was never supposed to feel like a battle. It was never supposed to feel like a constant test. It was never supposed to require you to lose yourself in order to keep someone else. Real love does not demand that you chase it. Real love does not ask you to prove your worth. Real love does not thrive on confusion. Real love grows where there is honesty, consistency, trust, respect, and emotional safety. The moment you stop chasing people who cannot meet you emotionally is the moment you create space for people who can. And that is where your story begins to change. Not when someone finally chooses you, but when you finally choose yourself.